Let me hit you with something real quick. China has cut its U.S. Treasury holdings by over 40% in the last decade, and almost nobody in America is talking about it. While cable news is yelling about the next crisis, Beijing is quietly setting up ways to trade, borrow, and settle deals without touching the dollar. This isn't conspiracy stuff. It's documented, deliberate, and already happening. And yeah, it matters more to your money than most headlines you see. If you want to understand the yuan versus dollar fight, you don't start with speeches. You start with balance sheets and trade flows. In 2013, China held roughly $1.32 trillion in U.S. treasuries. By recent counts, that number has dropped to around $780 to $800 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's a strategic reduction of hundreds of billions of dollars in exposure to U.S. debt. And China didn't dump those holdings overnight. They trimmed them slowly, deliberately, year after year, to avoid market panic. At the same time, something else changed. In 2010, less than 1% of global trade was settled in Chinese yuan. Today, that number is still small compared to the dollar, but it's multiple times higher than it was a decade ago, especially across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. Energy deals with Russia. Commodity contracts with Gulf nations. Manufacturing trade inside Asia. Quiet switches. Real money. Meanwhile, the dollar still dominates. Roughly 85 to 90% of global FX transactions involve it. That's the key point most Americans miss. China isn't trying to flip the table. They're trying to shave the edges. Why? Because dollar dominance gives the U.S. leverage, sanctions power, cheap borrowing, and the ability to finance deficits without immediate pain. But leverage only works when counterparties have no alternative. Even partial alternatives weaken it. Here's the uncomfortable math for the U.S. Federal debt is now over $34 trillion, and interest costs alone are pushing toward $1 trillion per year. That system depends on strong, constant global demand for dollars and treasuries. If that demand softens, even modestly, the margin for error shrinks fast. This is why the battle stays quiet. No one wants headlines. China wants options. The U.S. wants stability. And the real story lives in the numbers most people never look up, but absolutely should. Here's the part that gets lost in U.S. media coverage. China does not need the yuan to replace the dollar to win strategically. That's an American way of thinking. First place or nothing. Beijing's playbook is different. It's about leverage, insulation, and optionality. Start with sanctions risk. After 2014, and especially after 2022, countries around the world watched the U.S. weaponize the dollar-based system through sanctions, asset freezes, and payment restrictions. Whether you agree with those moves or not, the message landed globally. If you rely entirely on the dollar system, you're exposed. China absorbed that lesson early. That's why China expanded its bilateral currency swap lines to over 40 countries, covering trillions of yuan in potential liquidity. These agreements allow trade partners to access yuan directly during stress. No dollars required. Again, this doesn't make headlines, but it changes behavior when pressure hits. Then there's payments infrastructure. China's cross-border yuan payment system, CIPS, now processes tens of trillions of yuan annually, connecting banks across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. It's still smaller than SWIFT, but it doesn't need to be bigger. It just needs to exist. Redundancy equals bargaining power. And don't ignore commodities. China is the world's largest buyer of oil, copper, iron ore, and agricultural goods. When the largest buyer starts saying, "We'll pay in our currency," sellers listen, especially when demand elsewhere is uncertain. Even if only 10 to 20% of those contracts move off the dollar over time, the impact compounds. For Americans, this matters because leverage cuts both ways. The dollar's dominance has allowed the U.S. to run persistent deficits with limited consequences. But leverage only works when it's exclusive. The moment alternatives become viable, even at the margins, the cost of policy mistakes rises. China's endgame isn't a yuan takeover. It's a world where the U.S. can't assume automatic compliance. And in finance, that's a meaningful shift in power. So let's bring this home for a U.S. audience, because this isn't about Beijing flexing. It's about what gives way inside the American system if dollar demand weakens at the edges. The first pressure point isn't the stock market. It's interest rates. When foreign demand for Treasuries slows, the U.S. government has to offer higher yields to attract buyers. That cost doesn't stay in Washington. It bleeds into mortgage rates, auto loans, credit cards, and small business financing. Americans already felt this in 2022 to 2024 when rates spiked fast. Now imagine that environment becoming the baseline instead of the exception. Second is policy flexibility. For decades, the U.S. could respond to crises by borrowing and printing at scale. 2008, 2020, even regional banking stress later on. That worked because global markets absorbed the debt. But with federal interest expense already approaching $1 trillion annually, every new dollar of debt carries more friction. Stimulus becomes less effective. Bailouts get politically harder. Mistakes compound faster. Third, and this one rarely gets said out loud, is inflation persistence. If the dollar's global role erodes even modestly, imported goods cost more at the margin. Not enough to cause hyperinflation, but enough to keep prices sticky. That's how you end up with inflation that doesn't crash. It just refuses to die. Now zoom out. The dollar is still the backbone of global finance. Roughly 60% of global reserves are still held in dollars. No rival comes close. The U.S. still has the deepest capital markets and strongest legal infrastructure on earth. This is not a collapse story. It's a margin story. Empires don't fall when the currency dies. They fall when assumptions stop working. When borrowing costs rise just enough to hurt. When policy tools lose punch. When confidence erodes quietly. China understands that. That's why they're not rushing. The real danger for Americans isn't panic. It's complacency. Because by the time the effects show up in everyday life, the structural shift is already locked in.